Hi, my name is Alex Osterwalder. I created the business model canvas, which you might know, and I founded a company called Strategizer. I'm based here in Switzerland. You can see beautiful Swiss mountains behind me, and it's a real pleasure to be with you, even if it's asynchronously and remotely. So I just want to share a couple of thoughts. Let me go into some slides here around building invincible companies, which is all about never stopping to reinvent yourself, always experimenting, always thinking of new business models, new value propositions, but never really believing that you're right. You always have to test as if you were wrong. So we wrote a whole series of books on the topic of innovation and entrepreneurship, and you can explore some of them if you're interested, because I believe innovation and entrepreneurship is like a profession. Now, like the medical profession, of course, you have to practice how to do this. You have internships. And in the medical practice, you, of course, also have to study anatomy and physiology. So that's what the books are about. Now, across what we've learned over the last 2 decades, there are a couple of simple truths. So you want to go from idea to real business to real impact. And that is the same for entrepreneurship and innovation, very similar professions in, of course, different contexts. And there are 2 things that you need to really deeply understand. I would call this the anatomy and physiology, the process of testing new ideas, new business models, value propositions, entrepreneurial explorations around technologies or market opportunities. You have business design, so this is about your business models and value propositions, and testing those in order to adapt them, because ideas are easy, vision is easy, but adapting them until you have a value proposition that customers care about and a business model that can scale. Now let's start with business design. You ideate, you basically prototype your business model and value proposition with the right tools. You assess, is this a good business model? Can it be big enough? Is the value proposition, is it interesting? You ask yourself, okay, could this work? Is this a good thing? And then immediately, as fast as you can, even if you design as if you were right, you get out of the building and you test. In terms of business design, what I mean with this, it's not a physical prototype of your product or digital prototype of your product or value proposition. It's a conceptual prototype. So with the business model canvas, one of the first tools we invented, you make explicit how you're creating value for your organization. Basically, how you create, deliver, and capture value. And then with the value proposition canvas, a second tool, you make explicit how your idea creates value for your customers. So you need to get these 2 things right, and we created 2 tools to get these 2 things right. And of course, you constantly adapt your idea until you're right. So we get here to the topic of testing. And testing is not about building, it's first about admitting that, and this is the hard thing to do, the smarter you are, you need to admit that you have no clue if your idea is going to work, in particular when you're really innovating. So risk and uncertainty is very high. So your only task as an entrepreneur and innovator is not to build something, not even to build a so-called minimal viable product first. Your only task is to reduce risk and uncertainty. And the first thing you're probably going to do is just talk to customers or use other experiments to test if you have a deep understanding of the jobs, pains, and gains of your customers. And only later on will you work towards an MVP. So you increase the amounts of money you spend on testing, on experimenting, with the decreasing uncertainties. That's how it works. So in terms of process, what does this mean? This means we first need to ask, what are the most uncertain things, our hypothesis? Which things need to be true for my idea to work? And then only when you prioritize the most important hypothesis, and that's often generally around the jobs, pains, and gains of your customers, that's when you design experiments. And it's rarely building something as the first thing. So you don't start with minimal viable products. I would want to see evidence that you have a good understanding of jobs, pains, and gains first. You experiment there. And when you have some data, some evidence, some insights, you learn from that. And then you decide, Are you going to go back to the drawing board, change the value proposition and business model, or are you going to continue to test? So as an entrepreneur and innovator, you go through this double loop all the time. In your head, 24 hours a day becomes an obsession. And in the field, well, again, you prototype your value propositions and business models, extract the hypothesis, prioritize, and then test. Now, let's have a quick look at how this looks like in the field. Experimenting, again, doesn't have to be and rarely is first an MVP. Could be, doesn't have to be, rarely is, because there are cheaper ways and faster ways to experiment, even in the digital world. So, for example, take a brochure. And you could define, if you wanted to, depending on the definitions, the brochure as an MVP. But the point here is that you can think about the jobs, pains, and gains of your customers, come up with a value proposition, and make it tangible with the brochure. This is exactly what the American Family Insurance has done when they wanted to test, experiment, a new value proposition, a risk insurance for farmers. And David Bland talks about this quite a lot. My co-author, lead author actually of Testing Business Ideas, he shows that they put together a brochure that looked like this, and on the brochure there was a so-called call to action. So they handed out these brochures at a farming convention, and then they just tried to see who would get back to them with a so-called call to action. Who would call them? Who would write an email? And they would look at the conversion rate from people who took the brochure and then wrote back to them, and they would learn from that. So typically they learned that one segment, one type of farmer was more interested, so they pivoted the value proposition and the marketing towards that particular farming segment. They didn't build anything and they learned a ton. And then of course later on they would launch their MVP. So again, depends a little bit how you define your MVP. If a brochure goes as an MVP for you, you're spot on and you're learning. But even before you do that, you want to have a deep understanding, the evidence of your customers' jobs, pains, and gains. Now, very important to understand, it's not about one experiment. And I'll show you what Tesla did in the early days. Martin Eberhard, one of the co-founders, 2003 they started, 2008 they launched the Roadster. They had testing, experimenting in their DNA. And with his co-founder, Mark Tarpenning, there's a nice video here. They show how they did a whole series of experiments to gather evidence. The first experiment was very simple. It's called Boomerang, where you use existing products in the market, talk to your customers, and understand what they care about. And of course, that's how electric vehicles looked back then at the time. Not so amazing. So they learned a ton of what customers cared about. Then they did build a so-called MVP, a mashup. They bought a Lotus Elise and they turned it into something that looked like an electric vehicle. They could learn from the customers, but they didn't stop there. What they did is they went on and launched a landing page where they could collect emails. So up here, they would ask people to sign up so they could see how many people would convert to emails. And then they did a pre-sales where you could make a down payment of $100,000 and become part of the 100 Collector's Edition Tesla Roadster Club. So amazing how they went through these two. So you always have to design as if you were right and test as if you were wrong. You go through this double loop. But very important, this is a profession. You get better at this over time. You don't start as a seasoned professional. So when it comes to innovation and to entrepreneurship, we need to accept that this is a different profession from managing a business. It's different hard. And we need to, like in the medical profession, understand the physiology, anatomy of business models and value propositions and testing. And we need to get the practice by doing it again and again and again. But you need both. It's not just about learning from the anecdotes and doing the practice. You need a deep understanding of business models and value propositions, because the difference between a great business model and a mediocre business model can actually mean success and failure. One silly example to stop, and I like learning from historic examples. the first photocopying machine, the Xerox 914, was launched only because they figured out a business model to launch this insanely expensive technology. Through leasing, they could bring it into the market, and they would earn by selling photocopies, and it would become a great company before, of course, they forgot to innovate. So one thing you can never stop doing is reinventing yourself and continue experimenting, and always see this as day one. So I hope I gave you a couple of ideas. Just want to throw some things at you in the 10 minutes I had. So have fun being an entrepreneur, and don't despair if the first ideas don't work. You get better at this over time, and the statistics show that actually after the age of 40, you'll find, the largest number of successful entrepreneurs. But of course, this is just a statistic. So most important, get started, learn and adapt to become a great entrepreneur. Good luck.